It's time to open up this session for discussion. I have some very qualified dialogue partners joining me on stage. Let's begin with a quick introduction.
Trade sanctions are taking the world by storm. At least 20,000 sanctions are currently active. The result? A downturn in the global economy. A disruption in global supply chains. A world bracing for growing inflation. In times of globalization, are there any winners in trade wars? Session 3, Trade Wars, no long-term winners. And the dialogue partners for this session are Pat Breen. He is Ireland's former Minister for Trade and Business. Simon Lacey, former Vice President, Huawei. Wasika Ayesha Khan, Member of Parliament, Bangladesh. Richie Santos Diaz, Senior Strategic Advisor of the Corporate Group. Moderating this session is WION's Managing Editor, Palki Sharma Upadhyay.
Welcome to the session. And we have Wasika joining us from Bangladesh. Pat Breen, I want to begin with you. You're an expert in the field of trade and commerce. And my question to you is this. Would you say that trade wars are spelling the end of globalization?
Good morning, good afternoon, I suppose at this stage to everybody. Good afternoon to everybody, and thank you, Palki, for the introduction. Can I first of all, like the previous speakers, I think I'm one of the first Irish ex-ministers to address this forum, just to sympathise with the people of UAE on the death of Sheikh Khalifa and to wish new President Mohammed every good success. Before I start, can I just say to you, Palki, the relationship between Ireland and India is very strong. Not just in relation to the colour of our flags, but also the former Prime Minister and incoming Prime Minister will come in at the end of the year. Leo Varadkar, his father is from India, was a doctor from India. And so I think when the new Prime Minister takes over again with those Indian connections, it'll further strengthen the relations between Ireland and India. To answer your question, I suppose, in relation to globalisation is really important. I think it will continue. I think the trade wars that are ongoing at the moment, they will have to be resolved, the disputes in some way or another. I mean, we saw in 2018 when Donald Trump put tariffs on goods coming in from Europe to the US, and the issues that were going to happen as a result of that, particularly in relation to Boeing and Airbus, who are two competitors, one from Europe and one from the US, and of course the steel community, the steel tariffs as well. And this was going to cause huge disruption for the whole European community. And the European community is a big bloc of countries together, nearly 500 million people. And this dispute was going to harm the relationship because Europe exports about 24% of their goods into the US. So the US is a very important trading partner. And as a result of this and as a result of dialogue with the formation of the Technology and Craft Council, we were able to, this was a council that was elected by the various two countries with high-level both ministers and secretaries of state from the US and trade representatives on this. They were able to deter those sanctions and put them off. So you can see yourself, dialogue is extremely important when you're dealing with trade wars. Trade wars, the reality is, there may be short-term winners in trade wars, but in the end, it's the people that you're trying to protect that will lose most in this. So no, I don't think it's the end of globalization. Maybe, when Donald Trump, said that he wanted to make America great again, I think that's impossible in today's modern world, because, companies that invest abroad, and Ireland is the home of many pharma companies. From it has one of the, I suppose, 20 of the top 20 pharma companies in the world are based in Ireland, and they're there for one reason. Donald Trump at the time said these companies must come back to America so as to create jobs. But it doesn't work like that, because these companies are in Ireland for a number of reasons. First of all, to serve the European market, which is a very large market. So no, I think it's not the end of globalization. There are going to be blips, I suppose, all the way through, as we've seen down through the years in relation to trade wars. We saw what happened in the Great Depression back in the 30s. And what happened there was, people were afraid that imports were going to, people were going to lose their jobs. And so they put tariffs in place. And those tariffs eventually led to huge inflation, which we talked about there earlier. And as a result of that, down the road came the World War II. So we have to learn from the lessons of the past, but it's difficult. But I think the word relationship is going to be really important during our debate here today, because relationships with countries, diplomatic relationships, economic relationships are extremely important if we're to ensure to end trade wars, and of course to ensure that we don't end globalization, which is really important for small open countries like Ireland, where we produce enough of food to feed 35 million people with a population ourselves of 5 million people. So we have to get our goods off the island, and it's only by trade and by having partners in trade and relationships that we can continue to do that in the future.
Simon, you've been the Vice President of Huawei, which is, whether we like it or not, the market leader in 5G, and many countries are trying to protect their interests by raising concerns about their links with the Chinese government. Every time there is a trade war or the threat of a trade war, leaders tend to sell the concept of self-sufficiency. But in this interlinked and interdependent world, is it possible for countries to be completely self-sufficient to insulate themselves from the threat of a trade war?
Okay, well, let me also begin by thanking WION for the generous invitation. The third time I'm speaking at the summit, and it's always good to be with you and to hash out these issues, these very important issues with you. I'd also like to present my condolences for the loss of the nation's leader. So I think the answer to your question is I've lived and worked and done trade policy in sort of 30 countries at this point in my career, and there's this seductive kind of attraction to the notion that we could be self-sufficient in something, so we wouldn't depend on others. I spent 4 years in working in Indonesia, and the whole Indonesian trade policy and agricultural policy is built on this notion that Indonesia should be able to provide for itself. But that's just, that's first of all a fallacy. I mean, it's just not physically possible for countries, for most countries. I mean, some big countries, sure, they can become self-sufficient in just about almost everything that they need. But the economic theory going back to Adam Smith and David Ricardo, absolute advantage, comparative advantage, those policies are economically self-defeating, and so there's just no rational or sane reason why a country would want to be self-sufficient in everything. You know, I lived in Switzerland for many years, and Switzerland has this incredibly protectionist agricultural policy. I remember somebody said once, you know, in Switzerland they could grow pineapples if they wanted to, but they would just be 15 times more expensive than the pineapples that they could import from Taiwan or Hawaii or wherever, just because they'd have to grow them all in greenhouses, and so it'd be ridiculously expensive. The other thing I think you have to remember, you know, going back to the point that Pat made about globalisation, and this sort of ties into what I'm saying about comparative advantage and absolute advantage. I mean, globalisation is not over because the economic rationales for globalisation are still very much there, there's just too much money to be made by integrating these markets, and so yes, we will see some sort of limited decoupling in areas of sort of sensitive technologies and data. We're starting to see that as big Chinese technology companies are being forced to delist from the US stock exchange, and as we're seeing Huawei, for example, run into some serious headwinds in the US and in some other markets. But basically, globalisation is not over. It's just going through a sort of realignment as countries sort of think about you know, how deeply integrated do they want to be with certain countries. I think, you know, deeper integration is really only going to be possible and is only going to be desirable with countries that you share a number of values with. And I think that's really where globalisation is headed. It's more of a sort of values alignment rather than a full-scale decoupling.
Interesting. Wasika Aisha Khan, we are saying the title of the session is Trade Wars, No Long-Term Winners, and I'm curious to know if you agree with this, because there seem to be some winners. When China and the US were engaged or have been engaged in a trade war at the peak of it, I understand a lot of garment manufacturers especially that worked with China were looking at opportunities in Bangladesh. So would you say that your country has been a beneficiary of some sort of trade wars?
Thank you, Palki. It's a pleasure to join the Global Summit. I've always admired the WION team since its inception. I offer my heartfelt condolences to the people of United Arab Emirates and wish their new leader well. Trade wars, in my opinion, are not sustainable. And if you're talking about beneficiaries of trade war, the supply and demand will actually decide which country is the best producer of a certain commodity. And Bangladesh has always been competitive in the RMG sector. And we are number 2 in exporting RMG, as you know. So the trade war between US and China may benefit somewhat, but it will not make a sea change in Bangladesh's economy. Like, you know, self-reliance versus international trade has occupied the center stage of political and academic debates for most of the 20th century. Now we are talking of trade wars and sanctions in the new global scenario. But during the pandemic, we did face much supply chain disruption, and we learned to cope with that. When we are talking about sanctions and protectionism, ultimately who suffers? I think the consumer suffers the most. And for a developing economy like Bangladesh's, you know, the burden of tariff subsidies, protection subsidies, and sanctions will be ultimately borne by the consumer. In any other nation, it's the same case. The price of the products produced rises by the amount of tariff or protectionism or sanctions or whatever is the reason on the import of similar goods. So this is essentially a transfer of resources from the consumer to the producer. So by sanctioning products and by picking up trade wars with certain nations, how are we being fair to the consumer, the biggest stakeholder in the economy, and how environmentally friendly is a trade war? What about the carbon footprints? And this is, I don't think it's going to be, my personal opinion, it's not going to be sustainable. And even before the winds of war began, there were protectionism by tariffs. And the tariff regimes, when the tariff regimes are there, companies keep asking for more protection instead of becoming self-reliant. And that has to be talked about, I think, more, because that has been going on for years and years and years. To be fair to the consumer, to make an economy sustainable, we must offer the consumer a choice. And if I talk about our regional trade, in the South Asian region, it is very strange that we trade much less with each other than with the rest of the world. It became quite apparent during the pandemic period. And it would have been so much better if we were trading more with each other. The supply chain disruptions would not affect us so much. But I hope that, the world will get better and the consumers will get, the best of what they deserve. Thank you.
Right. So we've spoken about policymakers, we've spoken about the consumers whose interests must be safeguarded at all times. As a representative of global business, how do you account for the possibility of a trade war at a time when there are obvious supply chain disruptions, at a time when there is a lot of talk of recessionary pressures on economies the world over? How do companies deal with these decisions and changes?
Yeah, so, can you hear that? Yeah. So, I mean, first of all, like everybody else in this room, I'm a resident now of Dubai, so my condolences as well. And my colleagues here who had different kind of points of view in terms of, from a policy point of view, from a government point of view, from a multinational point of view, with regards to kind of the everyday consumer, when you kind of asked the audience earlier, you said how many have seen inflation from a consumer point of view, right? And we don't, as the average person, whether it be a business or a person, you don't actually think about, what's going on in terms of, oh, this government, they're going to put 25% tariffs on China. You're thinking about how to survive, right? You're thinking about, from a business point of view, as well as from a consumer point of view. And it's what you were saying earlier, the consumer price index in the United States, it was the highest in March in 40 years. It was 8.5%. So from a business point of view and from a consumer point of view, you see these costs, they add up. One, for example, the pandemic. I think it's not even the pandemic, but the Suez Canal, right? I think that taught a lot of businesses, a lot of governments in terms of, oh my God, I'm so reliant on, say, China, for example. I mean, 8 out of the 10 largest ports in the world, busiest, are actually in China, if you count Hong Kong as well. So as a business, for example, maybe if you're exporting, if you're developing goods, and let's say 70% of it is coming from China, you start thinking, and many have started doing this, how do I diversify my supply chain, where it's not solely coming from one specific port, maybe near Shanghai, that maybe it's coming from other sources, maybe from Bangladesh, as you were saying earlier, in terms of other countries, Vietnam, Bangladesh have been emerging, where China is actually becoming so expensive now that actually they are benefiting from these developments, and businesses are seeing that, right? They rather than, pay, with the increase of costs, I'm gonna get my stuff from Bangladesh, or I'm gonna get my stuff from Vietnam, because it's much cheaper, it diversifies, it mitigates my risk. You always wanna mitigate your risk as a business. And I think it's not even just that I'll twist it a bit and then add the digital transformation, right? I think all of us in the pandemic, I mean, hands up in Dubai in this audience, we're using online shopping more than you were prior, right? I was. My Amazon account just went like, woof. So literally, you know, as a business as well, I think the word for this year is the I word, inflation. You know, we've all said, like I said, the CPI in the US was the highest in 40 years. And businesses obviously are thinking about this. You know, in the US, it's hard to get baby formula at the moment apparently. So as a business, you know, to answer your question, you start thinking about it, you know, from your cash flow, from where you're sourcing your supplies, your talent, and in terms of digital transformation, where the pandemic accelerated that, I think also even where your staff are working, in terms of how that is, where actually, do I have to be in the same city? Can they be working in Bangladesh or Ireland? And I'm doing it all here.
So businesses have no choice but to evolve.
No,
basically,
of course, they're going to lose money.
Yes, Pat Breen, we mentioned China, and we recently saw China blocking Lithuanian trade because they allowed a de facto Taiwanese embassy in Lithuania, and that's just one of the examples of how countries tend to weaponize trade. And I know that we have international mechanisms to ensure that this does not happen, but it happens all the time. So how do we make sure that essential items and trade are not used to buy political leverage?
Well, I suppose that's the question, a very difficult question to answer at this point in time as the world is going through a major transformation, particularly in relation to, as what our previous speaker talked about, the whole area of chain supply. I think that's something that's going to be a big issue for the world, including food supplies as well, you know, which is essential. You look at what's happening in Ukraine. The former Prime Minister or the Foreign Minister talked about it there in his contribution. The blockades of the ports in the Black Sea by Russia, and also, I suppose, COVID-19 has had a huge effect on the whole global supply area, and particularly in relation to cruise and ships, where, you know, disruption has caused a shortage of cruise and ships. You also have a situation where Russian, you know, goods ships are blocked from European ports. So, and of course, as you know, the Ukraine is known as the food basket for Europe. You know, they produce a fifth of the world's grain, and that's an essential product. And they export 90% of that. And they are trying to find, with the ports of Odessa blocked and other ports, they are trying to find other alternatives to distribute that. But it's going to be a big issue, I think, for many countries down the road. And, you know, you just can't change to other suppliers all at once. It takes time. And you talked about, you know, the importance of again, go back to relationships and how food can be used as weaponry. We saw a situation in the US-China situation where China put huge tariffs on grain going into China, which more or less resulted in you know, the whole disruption of the grain going into China, and they have to find other markets for that. And of course, if you put tariffs on goods and you have a tit-for-tat situation happening, obviously the cost of the goods are going to increase. And that's going to put a huge pressure on countries. So, you know, to talk about no winners, yes, there are no winners in trade wars. But also, I think it's important to point out, why in the short term, you know, trade wars or trade sanctions and trade wars, they do protect jobs in the local areas. But in the long term, you know, they create bigger problems, particularly in relation to the cost of goods, which in turn will lead to inflation. And a lot of countries are facing that at the moment. In Ireland, we're lucky enough in this. In fact, I think we can sustain it. The Department of Finance just issued, you know, a bulletin in relation to the next 6 to 8 months. And while inflation may run at 6 to 7%, our economy will be able to sustain that because of the fact that we have a solid, you know, economy which is built on trade. I mean, every day of the week we export 37 million euros of food and drinks all over the world. That's a lot for our country. And why we can sustain that and why we can keep the deficit in place and keep attracting foreign direct investment into the country, which we are at the moment, particularly from, you know, the US and from, you know, but we're looking at other areas as well. We're not putting all our eggs in the one basket here in this. Presently, our biggest supplier, or our biggest exporter, number of exports is to the US, followed by the UK. And, you know, that's because I suppose of geopolitical reasons as well, because of the fact that UK is located alongside us. But one would think because of the hostilities between the UK and Ireland down through the years, that the UK would be a hostile partner, but it's not. Even in the difficult times, people still travelled from Ireland to England for work, and before we joined the European Union, actually, Britain was our major trading partner. And of course, what the European Union did, it opened up new markets for us, particularly within Europe and the single market, and it opened up other markets throughout the world as well. And of course, I think what's really important for any country in the world, in today's global world, because as my colleagues have said, we talked about the digital transformation and we talked about how small the world is to have a good trade policy in place. And again, that's going back to the relationships we have. So, you know, it's amazing that during the trade war between the US and China, Ireland actually increased its exports into China. Today, I think we export about 9%, 8 to 9% of our goods into China, and the same with the US as well. So while there are some winners, and I think my colleague in Bangladesh said this, there are some winners, particularly the bystanders, but it can be short term because of the situation. I mean, if you look at Mexico was a big winner, Vietnam was a big winner in the US-China trade war. But it's really important, I think, that the US and China now get down to serious business to ensure the end of the trade war. And hopefully, I think in the near future, President Biden will make a decision in relation to it. It takes, I think, leadership in both countries to ensure that we put an end to trade wars. And remember, the US and China are the two biggest economies in the world, and they can sustain themselves anyway.
Indeed. The only difference is that Joe Biden has to fight an election and the Chinese leader not so much. So I think you need reciprocity, and you need to have the domestic constituency on board. I saw Simon nodding when you said that they both have to sit across the table and talk. Huawei has been a big, I keep coming back to it, a point of contention. Would you call Huawei a victim of the trade wars, or would you call it a weapon in the hands of China that it will wield in a future that is going to be dominated even more by technology?
Right. I mean, look, let me just follow up on something that Pat said, or respond to the question you asked, Pat, which is what do you do against economic coercion? And the thing that we have to stop economic coercion is the rules-based order, which the Ukrainian Deputy Foreign Minister talked about. And so you've got a couple of really big countries, big markets that can exercise and exploit market power. But if you've got a strong set of rules, which we have in the form of the WTO, which you can enforce, then that goes a long way to constraining some of the big powers in some of the excesses and abuses that they can perpetrate. And so now the EU is sort of closing ranks with Lithuania, and the EU is a big market with incredible market power, but also regulatory power that it can export, and a solid set of values. I mean, the EU has really sort of transposed America as sort of the light on the hill. And the EU is sort of closing ranks now with Lithuania and making sure that China's actions do not go unpunished, and that there are consequences to those actions. Now, to get to your question on whether Huawei was a victim, I mean, people sort of tend to focus on the US-China relationship, and they sort of see these flashpoints or these points of sort of conflict. The reality is that these are also two markets that have a lot of common interests and a lot of points where they share common objectives. And the problem that Huawei had was that it was sort of on one of these flashpoints where the US and China don't share common objectives because they're in this sort of strategic rivalry for technological dominance. And ever since, I guess, going back a few decades, I guess was the third offset, the US has understood its military advantage. I mean, you go back to Vannevar Bush after the Second World War, the US has understood its military advantage very much in terms of also its technological superiority, and anyone that challenges that risks sort of running the gauntlet of American ire. And this is sort of what happened to Huawei. Being the sort of representative company from China, is it just assumed a position of dominance in handsets. I mean, for a while it actually overtook Apple, and it was like the #1 handset.
You're completely discounting the fact that Huawei is also very deeply linked with the government in Beijing, which cannot always be said about American technology giants.
That's actually not true. I mean, if you look at the boards of Boeing, or if you look at the boards of any big American companies, I mean, they are very closely tied to the American government, but not in the same way as in China. I mean, what you're saying is absolutely true. The Chinese state does exercise considerable influence over its economy, and it's just not possible to be a company with the size and the importance of a Huawei in China without having some sort of operational and close ties with the government. The government is just too pervasive in China. But people sort of kind of think that the US is this sort of free-for-all where the government, doesn't mess with the market economy, and China is the opposite. It's actually not true. I mean, the US government is sort of deeply involved in regulating and managing its companies too, but just, of course, not to the extent of China.
Interesting. I would want to dwell on that point, but maybe somewhere else, because this one is one of my favorite subjects. I want to get in. Sorry?
We'll meet again at happy hours.
Happy hours, yes. Wasika Aisha Khan, every time I have a discussion or a debate on trade wars, I always think of the chicken and egg question. Does trade dictate policy and politics, or is it the other way around?
Wow, that is a question which can be debated for days, I think, because for a developing country like Bangladesh, policy is formulated around the nation's needs, and trade comes after that. Now, like I said, if we are focusing more on regional trade, the policy will allow regional trade, and which we should focus more on. And in a very unpredictable scenario around the world now, policies have to, I think policies are fluid. Policies cannot be set in stone. And we must think and formulate and take policies and take decisions which is the best for our economy, and also a sustainable decision. And in the long term, and the long-term effect of which has to be good. And, when the big powers are behaving like petulant children in schoolyards, so small countries like us, small developing countries, we have to be very cautious, because we must think of our people, we must think of food security, we must think of energy security, we must think of our GDP growth, we must think how to take our nation to the future. And it is very important. Policy is very important. Policy will follow our aspirations of where we should go. Thank you.
Interesting. Richie, we're talking about policy, and we see sanctions becoming an all-pervasive aspect of policy with the way things are going, the military conflict spilling into other domains. Do you see more turbulence, more trade wars before we're able to strike peace on this front?
Yeah, so, the common theme for today's kind of discussion as a whole has been, Russia and everything going on there, so with regard, and Ukraine obviously, so So, you know, at present you see it where like Russia's banned, from SWIFT and all these kind of aspects in terms of that. Where I'm trying to get to is essentially with regards to everything going on, going to the theme of my colleagues here, it's just not sustainable, and you see this from the past. I mean, back in 2016, I wrote my first op-ed or second op-ed in Forbes in America, and I was writing about, the 14 free trade agreements that the U.S. had and still has. Back then we thought that under the Trump administration, those were going to change, minus formerly NAFTA, same thing basically. All those other free trade agreements were still there. So going to kind of, what we've learned in the past, I think we forget as well that trade is, and going to another theme that people mentioned in the previous conversations was this, it's not just the U.S. anymore, right? You have, we forget that, because this is WION, India is a BRICS country, right? Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Why did they use trade to get together? Because they are big emerging economies. And it's not so much to say that U.S. you're done. It's there's other players as well in terms of that. And I think, going back to, I think there was a comment on China earlier with my colleague here from Huawei. It's nothing new with the One Belt policy, because the U.S., with the Marshall Plan, had something like that back in the day after World War II with regards to giving money to Europe to rebuild after the war. It was something interesting fact as well. I think it was the UK, I think about 2 years ago, fairly recent, just paid off all its loans to the US on the Marshall Plan. I saw that fairly recently, so that was interesting. But it's just, looking at in terms of what Russia's doing, Russia's basically said we've been developing. So they've actually planned this, that they've been developing their own kind of equivalent of SWIFT. And I think China's doing something similar as well. So it's almost like it's not like overnight. They've kind of thought about this, maybe learning from the past that you can't just be reliant, but it is what it is. And I think going to my colleague's comment really quick on policy, I think you need to adapt it. And I think with digital transformation, you've seen that with cryptocurrencies, where countries like India have had, announced that they're going to do Indian rupee, tax crypto. So you have to be with policy as well, and filtering down to individuals that those policies also have to go with the times.
Right. Pat Breen, final question. Countries weaponize trade because they can. I believe some of them do. They use trade ties like China does, as we discussed, for political leverage. How do you protect yourself against such a possibility is question number one. And over the years, I think the whole world understands the pitfalls of dependence on China, and yet they walk into those traps. Is it only because of lack of alternatives, or is there more at play?
Palki, I suppose, the whole situation is China is a huge economy with 1.5 billion people. And I suppose over the years, China has been reaching out to the whole global world for trade and for business. I mean, we saw what they've done in Africa, where they have, produced a lot of money to poorer African development states and built infrastructure and provided money for other buildings as well. But at the same time, there's always a take in that as well. And of course, the advent of cheap labor is something as well. So the reality here is, I mean, Ireland is one of the largest suppliers of infant milk formula to China, and so trade is really important for us, specifically in that Asia area. And I think it's important that you don't, as I said, don't put all your eggs in the one basket. I think for a country, a small open economy, it's important that you trade with everybody as much as possible. I mean, this is really part of the importance of trade and free trade deals as well. Ireland is now part of the EU bloc. We don't negotiate ourselves for trade deals anymore. We let the EU as a bloc negotiate for us. That means that we're in a very stronger position to get better trade deals. And trade deals are very, very difficult to negotiate, and they take years. I remember when I was minister, the CETA deal was going through Europe, through the European Parliament and through Europe at the time, and it took 7 years to negotiate that free trade deal with Canada. So I think trade is a very important aspect of the whole subject of our conversation here today, the whole area of mission peace. And that's really important to ensure that we continue good relationships, diplomatic relationships with every country as much as possible. What's really important is to ensure that you continue to have that relationship, and to ensure that countries like China play within the rules. And I mean, the EU recently negotiated an agreement with China a few years ago, actually, just in the middle of the COVID situation. It's blocked at the moment because of China put sanctions on certain individuals in the European Parliament. But they had, negotiated a deal where China would deal with some of the human rights aspects, deal with supply and chain, supply, etc. And it was going to be in the favourable interest of both the European Union and China. Presently, it's stalled, and we don't know what's going to happen in the future in relation to it. But trade deals are really important for countries, particularly, to have these trade deals in place where tariffs are imposed, if necessary, fair tariffs. I think that's something and this is where the WTO comes into place, as Simon pointed out, the important role the WTO has in relation to helping developing countries and promoting jobs, because jobs are extremely important. There are, I think, about 165 countries part of the WTO, and they will be meeting in Geneva shortly to outline or to deal with a number of outstanding issues that are in the global world at the moment, particularly in relation to vaccines. So the WTO is an important role to play, and dealing, as you said, trading with China, it'll have its ups and downs. But at the same time, I think countries have to do that if they're to ensure that they sustain their economies.
I think they can start with better representation at these multinational forums like the WTO. India and South Africa have been fighting for vaccines to be made more accessible and technology to be shared, but that's a long fight. But I'm going to wrap this session. I think the big takeaways for us was that all of us agreed that there are no long-term winners in trade wars, though sometimes some bystanders do make short-term gains. And people and businesses tend to be collateral damage whenever two countries or regions engage in a trade war, and we need stronger laws and better enforcement. I think that sums it up. Thank you very much. And thank you, Aisha.